Hi everyone, my name is Edmund Munday. I am a senior product manager on Bitbucket Cloud at Atlassian. A few weeks ago, I published a video explaining to you all how we are using Jira Product Discovery to help with our idea triaging process, the way in which we collect ideas from the community, from engineers in our teams, from other product managers, from stakeholders around the business, and how we sort of filter them into our sort of collective backlogs within the Bitbucket Cloud teams. Um, that video will be available for you to go and watch. I'm sure there will be a link to it somewhere, wherever you're watching this. Either it'll be below me, probably on YouTube, or it'll be somewhere around this video in a blog post that we'll be sharing. So you'll be able to go and have a look at that as well. Uh, I wasn't aware that that video was going to get published publicly when I made that. So this one will hopefully be a little bit more polished because I'm now aware that these are going to be made public. Um, there was some really great responses to that previous video, and so now they're going to be going up for everyone to look at. So hopefully this one is a little bit more presentable. Today I'm going to be showing you all through the next step in the process that we go through while using Jira Product Discovery, or JPD, as I'm going to acronymize it to, when managing our sort of product management workflow in Bitbucket Cloud. And the next step in that process is prioritization. So at this point, we assume that ideas have sort of made it through our ideas inbox that I showed you all in the previous session. And they are now into our prioritization process where we review all the ideas that have kind of made it past the first filter and decide which of those are the most important, which of those are going to get worked on next, and what sort of the relative order of priority is for each of the items that are being looked at. This is where a lot of teams actually kind of start in the process. Not all teams have that kind of initial triaging process or filtering process. Particularly if you're a smaller team, you probably might not need that first step in the process. Being quite a relatively large team, I guess being a very sort of public team, we do get a huge volume of suggestions and ideas coming in from the community, from our own employees, from various stakeholders. And so we need that initial sort of triaging process. But for a lot of teams, you might be kind of skipping that and you might jump straight to the prioritization process. Effectively, every product management team is going to need some kind of process to prioritize ideas that are coming in. You want to be avoiding building things based on just what you kind of think is most important, or sometimes what the most senior stakeholder in the room thinks is important. I'm sure we've all been in that scenario. So the idea behind this process is to create an objective framework for prioritizing ideas to allow you to have some level of kind of scientific structure around what you do and when. Now, I want to be really clear, this is not a extremely rigid and well-structured scientific process that's going to give you the absolute optimized result every single time. We live in the real world. You are not going to have a perfect outcome every time, and we're not intending to. The idea here is to make sure that a relatively good level of thought is going into the decisions around what we invest our engineering effort in, because we do have a limited amount of engineering effort. To give you some reference points, Bitbucket Cloud has around about 100 engineers working on it. Now that's a decent number, but it's not thousands. And so we do have to really ruthlessly prioritize what we do and don't work on. And for every 100 ideas that get proposed, we probably work on one or maybe two. And so this prioritization process is really, really critical to that. Now, for the purposes of this video, I have extracted out a subset of the real prioritization sort of matrix that we're currently using in Bitbucket Cloud. So these are real things that we are looking at right now. I'm using a subset because for obvious reasons we can't we can't share our entire backlog and all the things we're considering. But there's a subset here which gives a really good example, and these are things that are actively being looked at and considered and worked through within the teams. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to walk through each of the fields and kind of explain what they are and what their purpose is. And then at the end, I'm going to go through the kind of mechanics of exactly how the process works, because there is there are some mechanical elements to it. There's some calculations that go into it that I want to share, that I think will be really valuable for everyone because that's where really the powerful part of Jira Product Discovery or JPD comes through. The other really important part to note with this is that these are the same tickets, the same cards that were created at the triaging process. They've just moved through the workflow. So I haven't had to recreate any of these after they were proposed and then accepted into the backlog. When things are accepted into the backlog from the previous video, they just land automatically in this new view. It's the same card, all the information, all the context is still there from the previous steps. And this is what makes JPD really powerful, is that you put the data in once and you don't have to repeat it. You can chop and cut the data in different views in JPD to get different outcomes depending on what you need to do. So this view is our prioritization view, but it's very different to our triaging view, but the data underneath is all the same. We don't have to double enter any data ever. And that really is the magic of JPD, along with a bunch of other things as well. But I'm sure anyone who works in a product management role or anything kind of similar will say the amount of double entry of information can be backbreaking. It can be really, really frustrating to have to re-enter the same information in multiple different locations because you want to use it for different purposes. JPD gets rid of that. You have the one underlying piece of data, and then you can view it in infinitely different ways. So we're here looking at the exact same information we did in the triaging process, just a different view for a different part of the process, which is prioritization. All right, let's kick this off. So as with all JPD views, the first column you're going to see is the summary. It's basically just like the title of the idea. So these all have names. You can probably tell from the name roughly what they are. And the idea is that the PM for each item should be able to tell you pretty quickly what each of these actually are going to be. Now the details on them. One field that is missing from this view, I just realized, is actually the product manager. So let's go and quickly add that super quick just to admit. So I'm just going to add the assignee. So as far as we use JPD, the assignee is the product manager that is responsible for the item. I'm just going to move that to the front. And now a great example, I've just shown you how quick and easy it is to add a field to a view in JPD. So I just went and added the assignee field. I just went and moved it to the beginning of the list so that we can see who the PM is for each of these items real quickly. So we've got Patrick, we've got Gayatri, we've got me, and we've got Dave. So these are the PMs who own each of these items. So they're the people that can speak on each of these items to sort of when we need to go into more detail. Next column in the view is the status. Now, at Atlassian, we have a workflow that we refer to as the Atlassian way. It goes through a series of steps. So you can see here the status each of these are in. The number basically represents the order in the process that it is in. And that's just to help when you're looking through the list. It alphabetizes them so they're all in order. But you can see some are here in backlog, some are in wonder, which is kind of our like pre-discovery phase for people who sort of use the phrase discovery. Explore is our more kind of detailed discovery. It's like the solution definition phase. And then make is pretty self-explanatory. That's when we're making the thing. And then backlog is kind of the where it's sitting before it really gets kicked off. And so we keep things on our prioritization view all the way through just to help us as a reference point to know where things are as we're sort of working through the process. So that's what status they're in. The status also heavily helps us control what views things show up on. We use things like the status as well as other fields to determine whether we want something to show up. So for example, this view is a combination of the status. So I'm saying things should be either in backlog, impact, wonder, explore, or make. Actually, impact is wrong. It shouldn't be there. Backlog, wonder, explore, or make. And this should have the checkbox demo video checked. Now that demo video checkbox is one I added just recently to create a filter of these items to items that are appropriate to show in this video. So in the real version of this view, it would basically be anything that is in any of these 4 statuses will show up on this view. Okay, moving along, we have what we call our investment line. So at any point in time, Bitbucket Cloud is focusing on like maybe 2 or 3 what we will call key investment lines. These are strategic priorities, and these will kind of align to the OKR that we are, or OKRs plural, that we are targeting at the point in time that we're using the board. So for example, 2 of our main strategic pillars at the moment are enterprise migration, so helping our large complex customers that are on our server and data center products migrate to Bitbucket Cloud. And another of our strategic pillars is developer productivity. So helping improve the productivity of developers working in Bitbucket Cloud. These correlate to OKRs that we are working towards over the course of the year. And we use that as a way of grouping work items. And so you can see here, all the projects, the ideas here are actually grouped by that investment line. And so I can specify that here in the group by section. I could change this to a different field if I wanted to. I don't want to, I'm going to leave it at that. You can see here we have these three main investment lines. Run the business is kind of our, what we call keeping the lights on. It's just the stuff that you need to do to kind of keep things working. We do have plenty of items in that category. I just haven't included any in this view. And the enterprise migrations and developer productivity are the other two main strategic pillars that we're sort of focusing on. Moving along further, we have what we call group. Now, group in other organizations you might refer to as something like a tribe. That is basically a collection of teams that are focusing on a similar area of the product or a similar set of missions. So for example, my group is the DevOps Automation group. Now that includes our two teams for Bitbucket pipelines and one team for our extensibility framework that allows people to build app extensions and things like that in Bitbucket Cloud. We have other groups. There's the Enterprise Experience group and the Developer Experience group, and these map to groups of teams that will be working on different things. So this just helps us know sort of who is doing what, things like that. Next level down is the team. This is basically just a subset of the group. So for example, the CI or continuous integration team is part of the DevOps automation group. Again, this is just filtering things down. And finally, we get to this area. And this is kind of where things start to get probably a bit more interesting, to be blunt, from a prioritization perspective. This is where we start to actually do the prioritization process. So I'm going to walk through how this all works. So basically, we have a series of fields that you score. And based on the scores put into each of these items, it will output a priority score at the end. Now, I should probably put a disclaimer here that these items here have actually not been scored correctly for effort. They're all sitting at a very low. That's just because they've only recently gone into the board. So the score here is not going to be very accurate. So I might actually remove these from the view real quickly because it's going to probably get a bit confusing otherwise. And we'll keep the ones that actually have got the effort score here because that's probably a bit better example. But these items are used, so these fields are used to help us generate our priority score. And the priority score is basically what we use to do a first pass prioritization of work that's kind of in the queue to be done. Now, we have literally hundreds of items in this actual list, like in the full size version of it. This is obviously a subset right here. But when you're going through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of suggestions, it can get really difficult to prioritize them. So having a way to quantitatively provide scores to things and then generate an actual number at the end to help you prioritize things is really powerful. And that's what I'm going to be going through today of what we do. Now, behind this priority score, you see here this little fx. What that stands for is basically this is a function or it's a calculated column. So there's a bunch of math going on that calculates this column. I'm going to walk through all of that math in a second, but I'm going to take you through the main kind of columns first. So the first column for generating this output is the tier column. So you might know that Bitbucket Cloud has pricing tiers. We have a standard/free pricing tier. We have a premium pricing tier. And we are hoping at some point in the future, we're planning to have an enterprise pricing tier. And now we don't incorporate the pricing tier of items significantly into our prioritization process. It's not the determiner of whether or not we do something, but we do want to include it as a variable. It's a pretty low impact variable, and I'll tell you the exact sort of math behind it in a little while. But we do want to include it in the thought process because reality is if something is a premium feature, an enterprise feature, it does add a bit more value. It adds a little bit of extra priority, but it's an extremely small multiplier, and I'll go over that in a bit more detail in the future. Next column is the effort column. Now, what you're going to see here is basically we're trying to build up to a pretty standard value divided by effort calculation. But that can be challenging because value is not a simple thing to calculate. There's no just like one easy value score you can give to stuff. So a lot of this is about generating that value score that we want to use. Effort is actually pretty simple to calculate. It's a pretty linear value. And so you can ascribe a number to it pretty easily. So all of these are on a 5-point scale. The tier one is not, it's a drop down that has 3 items. But one of the really cool things about JPD is that for either scales or drop downs, you can ascribe numeric values to each of the items in the drop down, and then you can use those numeric values in your function fields when you're writing calculated fields. So for example, in here, you see this little like scale icon with a 1. What that means is I've ascribed a numerical value of 1 to the standard slash free drop-down item. And you see here 2, I've ascribed a value of 2 to the premium drop-down. And if I set something to enterprise, you would see that I've ascribed a value of 3 to the enterprise tier, which means that if I reference this prios-tier, so priority-tier field in a calculated field, I will get the number. I won't get the string value. And that's really powerful for when you want to create calculations, because you can have a value that looks like it's a word, but underneath it there's a number, and you can use that to do math. That's why this is a really, really cool feature of JPD. The actual like range fields, like the numeric value behind this is probably a bit more self-explanatory. 5 is a 5, or 1 is a 1. And so if you reference the field in a function field, you'll get the numeric value of the range that you selected for the item. So for example, priority effort would be a 3 in this. And then you can use that to then create these function fields. We'll go into that in more detail in a sec. So the priority effort is pretty self-explanatory. It's the effort that the work will take. Now, realistically, calculating effort at this kind of level of abstraction is next to impossible, and you will get yourself into trouble if you try to be too precise when calculating effort at this level, because realistically, you can't do it. You're going to be wrong. So we take a bit more of a conservative approach, and we say, well, look, rather than trying to say how many weeks or how many months something's going to take, because realistically, you're probably going to get it wrong at this point in the process, we look at it a bit more subjectively and say, well, look, based on this feature, what is the measurement of time you would use if you were asked to estimate its level of effort? Is this something that you're going to be able to do in weeks? Is it something you're going to be able to do in sprints? That's per fortnight or per 2 weeks. Is it something that you're going to be kind of thinking in terms of months, quarters, or years? We have found, even though that is a less precise way of measuring things, you actually end up getting better results, because people are much more comfortable giving you an estimate when it's measured like that, and they tend to not like pad out the estimate overly, because you're not being asked for a really precise number. And realistically, we actually found it to be more accurate, because realistically, quite often when you try to do an accurate estimate, particularly early in the process like this, you're just going to be wrong. Whereas this kind of estimate tends to be quite often more accurate, and it's enough for our purposes here. It also has a nice benefit of things that are really big, things that are going to take years, quite often have really high levels of value. But if you actually do a direct like effort versus value calculation, because they're so big, it kind of messes up the numbers a little bit, and you end up with really low scores. Whereas saying that something that's going to be years is a 5, something that's going to be weeks is a 1. Obviously, there's more than 5 weeks in a year, but we found that this actually works really well when calculating your score. It does give you a really good representation of the effort versus value kind of ratio. Cool. So you saw here that I hovered over the header and this little dialog box popped up. And this is another really cool feature of JPD, is that for every field, you can give it a description. And that can be a kind of a rich text, WYSIWYG kind of description. So what we do in here is we explain what each value in the field represents. So we say, all right, priority effort, what measurement would you use? If you're measuring the effort, would you go 1 weeks, 2 sprints, 3 months, 4 quarters, 5 years? And that makes it really easy for people to pick the score they want to give, because it's not a subjective of like, I think this is a 5, I think this is a 3, and realistically you're both actually thinking the same thing, but for me a 3 is one thing and for you a 5 is the same thing. Up here we're saying no, a 3 is months, a 5 is years, a 1 is weeks. And that lets everyone operate from the same scale when they're giving these scores. And that's really important when you're doing this kind of exercise. Everyone has to be giving the same numbers when they're thinking of the same things, otherwise the scores end up being completely subjective. Next column, and this is where we start getting into defining value, is the dependency column. So one of the things that's really hard to calculate and work with when you are prioritizing things is if something doesn't have huge amounts of direct value itself, but it is a dependency for other things. Other things that are really valuable depend on it. So if you don't deliver that thing, you're not going to be able to do the stuff that's really important. And so even though it itself doesn't add lots of value, you need a way of including that dependency as part of your value calculation. So we have a field in here for dependency, and basically depending on the relevant score, you put that in the field. So if it's a 5, it's blocking really high value other work. If it's a 4, it's blocking some medium value work. If it's a 3, it's blocking low value work. If it's 2, it enhances but does not block other work. And if it's a 1, it's just no dependency. Nothing else is dependent on this work. So for example, there's nothing else which is dependent on us adding rebase from the UI functionality, whereas there's quite a lot that is dependent on us adding the ability to share pipeline YAML configurations around a workspace. So these are scored that way. And then we get into our investment pillars. So we have score field for each of the investment pillars, the enterprise migration pillar, and the developer productivity pillar. So basically you score based on the level of impact this item is going to have on that particular pillar. So 5 means that if we don't have this, it blocks most enterprise migrations. A 1 is if we don't have this, it blocks 0 enterprise migrations, and you score respectively. Same thing for developer productivity. We did the math to calculate what an hour, what is the equivalent of blocking most enterprise migrations in terms of value. We found that it was basically anything that can save the average Atlassian developer or the average user of Bitbucket Cloud over 1 hour every month. That's the equivalent amount of developer productivity that is the equivalent of that enterprise migration blocker. So we can score that way. Finally, we have a cost saving impact field. So things that will reduce costs, we obviously do want to find a way to prioritize. So if there's a way for a team to reduce costs dramatically, they can put an item in here and that will be scored respectively. And then finally, we have the two kind of most interesting fields, the priority score, which is the actual output of this process. Like we're saying, this is the priority of this item. This is the value of this item when you take into account effort and everything. And so we rank items by this priority score. And this is a calculated field. And then we have this thing called a strategic buff, which is a really interesting field. And it took us quite a while to kind of land on this as the thing we want to use. What this is for is this is how you put a finger on the scale. Realistically, these models never work quite perfectly. And so you end up in this awkward situation where you put the numbers into the model and you get an output and you're like, yeah, the output looks roughly right. But because of reasons, we just know that rebase from the UI, for example, or maybe code owners is more important than rebase from the UI. Now, we don't want to break this entire model and have to manually reorganize everything to get code owners above rebase from the UI if we just know that it's more important. And we found the best way to handle that is to have this thing called a strategic buff, which basically just lets you add some extra weight to a particular item if you know it's more important than another thing, but for some reason the numbers just don't add up. And so, a good example of what might elicit a strategic buff for an organization is if one really important strategic customer needs a certain thing, it might not be objectively the most valuable thing for you to do, but you just kind of have to do it. And so what you might do in that scenario is you might add a strategic buff. So we'll say add a strategic buff of 3. And what that does is it bumped up that final priority score by 3 is 60%. And suddenly it's now up above rebase from the UI. Now, if all we wanted to do is move it above rebase from the UI, I'd probably actually make this maybe like a 2, maybe even a 1. So a 1 makes it equal with that. So a 1 is give it a 20% buff. And a 2 is a 40% buff. So we can say, all right, do that to 40% buff. And it goes up to 2.3, even higher. Now, we have a rule which basically means that this field is only allowed to be used by the head of product. So basically, if you want to add a strategic buff, you're basically saying, I want to kind of circumvent the process just a little bit, pump something up higher than it should be. That needs to be approved by the head of product. And so our header, our header product will be the one that decides if something is allowed to sort of be basically manipulated a little bit, to be blunt, and pushed up the order. And we almost never use this, to be clear, but it's something that we needed to have in here for those very rare occasions where you just need something to get a little bit of a bump, but you don't want to have basically manually reorganize the whole board. And so this allows us to put a finger on the scale, but still leverage all the cool tools of like automatic sorting based on your priority score and stuff like that. So I'm going to remove that now and put it back to the way it was. And then I'm going to deep dive into this priority score field super quick and explain how we calculate this. Now, just a heads up, it's a bit of math coming up because this is a calculated field. And so we have a kind of bunch of calculations that happen under the hood that generate the value in this field. Now, you could, in one field, write one big giant like calculation, which gets you this number, but it would be pretty nasty to work with. I'm sure you've seen people who write those like just like crazy, disgusting, function things in like Excel or Google Sheets that are impossible to understand and give you these numbers at the end. We didn't want to do that because it makes it impossible to understand and also makes it really opaque. You don't know how this number's been generated, and also it's really hard to debug. You don't know if the number's been generated accurately. So what we have behind the scenes is we have a bunch of hidden fields, basically. We have a bunch of fields that calculate intermediate numbers that then roll up to this, and we just hide them. And the way we hide them is pretty simple. We just remove them from any views, and then in the picker, we prepend the field name with just ZZ. And that way, because the picker is alphabetized, they all just sit at the bottom and you basically never see them. So we don't put these on any of the views, except when we're making changes to them, and we prepend them with ZZ, which means they just kind of sit at the bottom of the field list, and they're kind of just hidden away. And that works really well for us. But I've created a view here which just shows you all of the actual hidden fields that we do use to create this final priority score. So you see there priority score, and you see here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these hidden fields, which basically are the inputs into the calculation to generate this final priority score field here. So what I'm going to do now for the sort of last couple of minutes is I'm going to walk you through how we create each of these sort of intermediate hidden fields and how that rolls up to the final priority score that we actually show and use to prioritize items. So the first thing we want to do is there are a few fields in our framework which essentially apply a multiplier to the score. And so what we want to do is we want to start by figuring out what that kind of multiplication ratio is that we want to apply to the value of items based on those multiplier fields. So when we say multiplier fields, what we're talking about here is the strategic buff. So that's adding like a little kind of percentage multiplier onto the underlying score for an item, and the tier. So we also add a little bit of a percentage buff onto the value of an item based on its tier. So I'll show you real quickly how that works. So the first two kind of hidden fields are this we call strategic buff multiplier and tier multiplier. And basically this calculates a numeric value for the level of multiplication we want to add based on the value of the field that was selected. So I've got this written down, some numbers. Again, it's going to get a little mathy, I'm sorry, but there's only a few things, and so I'm sure everyone will be able to keep up. So the strategic buff multiplier, basically this is how we give items a little bit of extra score based on the strategic buff. So it's a percentage multiplier I want to add to items based on their strategic buff, where 1 star equals 20% increase and 5 stars equals 100% increase. So if you get 5 stars, you're basically saying you want to double the value score. Now, how we calculate that is I go back to here and I go into this one here. It is basically the value from this strategic buff field. So that's a 1 to 5 because it's a range divided by 5. So if the value is a 1, we divide it by 5, you get 0.2, which is your 20%. So this is pretty simple. It's the value from the field divided by 5. If it's a 5, we divide it by 5 and we get 1, which is 100%. If it's 1, we divide by 5, we get 0.2, which is 20%. Cool, easy. Then the next one is the priority tier multiplier. So this is a percentage multiplier I want to add to items based on their pricing tier, where free equals 0% and premium equals a 20% increase. So going back to the field, we have the tier multiplier here, and how we get that basically. This is a little bit more fiddly. We say it is the tier value minus 1 divided by 10. So the reason we have to do it this way is because the value from the tier field is a whole number, it's an integer. So for example, if we wanted to get, say 10%, if we wanted an item which had a value of 2 to be 10% increase, which is what we want because free is a 0. So free and standard is a 0, premium is 10%, enterprise is 20%. Premium has an actual value in the system of 2. So we need to minus 1 from it to get it down to 1, and then we divide that by 10 to get to 10%. Same thing if it was the enterprise tier, it would be a 3 in the system. The absolute value would be 3. You would minus 1 to get that down to 2, and then you divide it by 10 to get that 20% multiplier. So this has a 10% multiplier, 0.1. Now, sorry if that's a little confusing, but we try to break this out so it's fairly easy to understand each individual item. Then we have the third field, which is the summed multiplier. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory. It is just the sum of all the multipliers. It's basically what we want to actually multiply the like a literal value by to get the kind of end result. So the way we sort of describe this is we have a summed multiplier, which is the total percentage multiplication I want to apply to items based on their strategic buff plus their tier multipliers. So we basically have a sum here, which is literally tier multiplier. So in the previous case, it was like 0.1 plus the strategic buff multiplier, which could be anywhere from 0.2 to 1. So let's say it's going to be 1.1 in total multiplication plus 1. Because we need to include the original 100% value. This is an additive process. We need to go, all right, the original value, just 1, plus the summed multiplication. So to give you an example, if you had a tier multiplier of 0.1, a strategic buff multiplier of 0.4, so this whole section would be 0.5, and then you would say 1 plus 0.5 equals 1.5, and that's what we're going to multiply the actual score of the item by to get that final kind of calculated score for that particular row. Now I understand it's a little bit complicated, but realistically, prioritization is a bit of a complicated process, and we found that this is the best representation of our prioritization process so far, but we tweak this on a regular basis. It lets us add a little bit of extra weight for things like the pricing tier and the strategic buff, which is really, really valuable when we want to do things that are a little bit more complex than just a straight up, value A plus value B plus value C. So this gives us our total multiplier. Going back to the view, we have the raw value, which is pretty simple. It's just the value from these fields summed together. So it's like that plus that plus that plus that. Really, really simple. We just call that the raw value. And then you have the calculated value, which again is actually pretty simple. It's just the raw value multiplied by the summed multiplier. So in this case, the summed multiplier is 1.1 because the strategic buff is 0. The tier multiplier is 0.1. 1 plus 0.1 is 1.1. The raw value is 14, which means the calculated value is 14 times 1.1, which gives you 15.4. This is now our actual value. This is what we're saying the actual value of this work is. And then finally, the priority score, which is the non-hidden column, this is actually pretty simple as well. It's just the calculated value divided by the effort. So most places will do a kind of value over effort calculation. Everything up to here is just trying to figure out the value because it's a bit of a complicated calculation. This last one, we literally get the score from the effort field and we divide the value by that score. So in this case, the score is a 3. The calculated value is 15.4. So we go 15.4 divided by 3 is roughly 5.1. It rounds to the nearest decimal point. And that gives us the 5.1. All right, so that's pretty much the process of how we go about our prioritization framework. So what we've talked about today is sort of how we review the items that we're prioritizing, so that we know what they all are, how we ascribe relatively simple scoring metrics to things so that we don't spend weeks and weeks and weeks poring over every individual detail of every item. We try to keep it simple because realistically, we try and move as fast as we can. How we have tools to kind of put a finger on the scale or change the output a little bit without breaking all of the nice automations that JPD gives us in terms of like sorting and filtering and automation. And then how to use the really cool function fields in JPD to get this priority score at the end, which is a pretty complicated, calculation. But because of how JPD lets you use this kind of intermediate fields and just add the values from them to each other, you can break it down to be really, really simple. So if I wanted to change how this score is calculated, I just come in here, edit the field. This is the actual expression that I write. And you'll see here, it looks a lot like something you might see from like an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Sheet expression. So I just write that in here and away I go and it's done. So I hope you all found this informative. Again, I hope it was value. Really appreciate you spending the time to watch this. Again, my name is Edmund Munday, so I'm a product manager in Bitbucket Cloud, and hope you all get some value and get out there and start using Jira Product Discovery. Thank you.